In this lesson, we'll go over how data flows through MongoDB Atlas to reach end users. We're going to use some terms like Atlas Control Plane User and MongoDB Database User in this lesson. In a later lesson, we'll break down the difference between these two in more detail, but for now you can think of the MongoDB user as an entity that can only interact with your MongoDB cluster through a driver or through the Mongo shell, and an Atlas user as an entity that can interact directly with the cluster as well as access the UI, and we'll then explain the data flow when using a virtual private cloud or a VNet. So first, let's look at how Atlas Control Plane users connect and interact with your Atlas cluster through the Atlas UI. An Atlas user logs into the Atlas UI through cloud.mongodb.com. This request happens using TLS. Authentication and authorization are mandatory. There is no unauthenticated access allowed to the MongoDB Atlas UI. The Atlas user is presented with a list of organizations that they belong to, and within each organization they can select a list of projects that they've been invited to. Atlas users are subject to role-based access control for each project and will not be allowed to perform any operations they are not authorized to perform based on their role. If features such as the Data Explorer, the Performance Advisor, or the Real-Time Performance Panel are enabled, that data will be fetched through the automation agent that runs on every data node. This communication is protected via TLS in flight using key files, and it's not shared outside of this layer. Next, let's go over how client applications or MongoDB database users are handled. A customer connects to your client application and begins to interact with it. How that communication happens is up to you, but I'm sure you're using TLS. The customer takes some action that causes the application to issue a request for data. It triggers a series of steps. The client application will connect to your Atlas cluster using TLS as a MongoDB database user. This is enforced, and there is no way to opt out of encrypted communication. However, TLS 1.2 can be set to required, fully deprecating TLS 1.1 and earlier. If your client application is served from a location outside your chosen Atlas cloud, the initial request will be routed through an Atlas gateway to enforce IP whitelist checks. If the client application IP address isn't whitelisted, the connection will be terminated at this point. IP spoofing, though incredibly hard, is a threat that must be considered. So there's an additional layer of security controls. The client application must authenticate to your MongoDB cluster. We're going to cover authentication mechanisms later in this course. This ensures that the purported user is who they say they are. Authentication is another security control like TLS that cannot be disabled. After authentication, the authorization process begins. We'll cover authorization in a later lesson, but authorization, simply put, is a check to ensure the MongoDB user has access to the desired resource that they wish to interact with. The database will perform the desired operation if the user is authorized to perform this operation, and then send the data back to the client application. This data will be encrypted in flight using TLS 1.1. Again, there's no way to opt out of this feature. Keep in mind, this initial handshake usually occurs once the client application is started and the driver initially connects. And that's a high-level overview of the data flow when using a public cloud without a virtual private cloud or VNet. Lastly, let's examine the data flow when using a virtual private cloud or VNet. As before, a customer or end user connects to your client application. The client application lives within your virtual private cloud and has an external IP and configured firewall rules allowing the connections outside of the cloud. And then the client application will connect to your Atlas cluster using TLS as a MongoDB database user. The connection is routed directly through your private network. Your MongoDB Atlas cluster is configured to only accept connections from IP addresses originating in this CIDR range. As before, the client authenticates either natively through MongoDB or using another service such as LDAP. The authorization step then kicks in, ensuring the correct role is assigned to the client application and it doesn't have access to data it shouldn't. The database will perform the desired operation only if the user is authorized to perform this operation, and then send the data back to the client application. And again, this is encrypted using TLS. And that wraps up our overview of the data flow diagram in MongoDB Atlas. Being able to see the system at a high level should give you a better feeling of how it works and more confidence in the protocols that are put in place. At all steps, there are strong security controls in place to ensure that your data remains confidential. At every boundary, data is encrypted to ensure integrity.